welcome to another episode of the ID Talk podcast. My name is Tony Bitsionis, and I'm joined by my good friend and co-host, Alex Prala. Alex, hello.
Hello.
Uh, Today we've got a great episode for you. We got a chance to chat with a very nice and very smart guy, Karl Holmqvist, founder and CEO of Lastwall. And we got into a topic that you and I have shown a lot of interest in over the weeks. We've touched on it a few times. We just don't understand uh, very much of it, and that's quantum computing, specifically something called quantum resiliency. And we wanted to speak to an expert, and Karl is certainly that. It was a very fun conversation, and I feel like we came out of it taking the first few steps into kind of really starting to understand this stuff and kind of get a sense of the scope and the stakes that quantum computing and quantum resiliency are sort of trying to address.
Mhm.
What did you think of that of the
Yeah, it
topic?
was. I'm glad you said it was fun because it was like a real intellectual journey. I like
Hmm.
that kind of thing, when we can talk to somebody who is a real expert in an area that we genuinely don't like fully understand,
Yeah.
and like we could just get to ask a lot of questions. And Carl was really nice, as you said, and for anyone listening who's not sure why ID Talk is talking about quantum stuff, listen,
Yeah.
it's important, and this is why we're trying to wrap our heads around it, that any kind of like data security is going to require quantum resiliency at some point.
Hmm.
And that includes biometric data and any kind of identity data. So we're trying to wrap our heads around it. Um,
Yeah.
and you mentioned Carl, he had like a good line about how you're either going to be too early or too late. Is that what he said?
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of like this is something that is coming. The threat of quantum computing is it's coming. We don't know exactly when.
Hmm.
And so the two choices are you either prepare too early and have a little bit of extra planning to do, or you're too late. And then kind of the consequences of being too late are not something that I think any organization would really want to consider.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's
And,
really
and
funny though.
oh, sorry.
So no, go ahead, go ahead.
Just to be clear, uh, Carl's company, Lastwall, it is involved in identity
Mhm.
technology. Like they are kind of they're focused on like high security applications of identity security, and they're concerned about like FIDO and um, MFA and stuff like that as well. So it's not that they're running like a quantum computing company, but Carl is just he has a lot of expertise in quantum resiliency, and that's why we wanted to talk to him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was gonna say, I just think it's funny that you very correctly said that we were trying to wrap our minds around it because my favorite part is just hearing us use analogies that are very particular to us. Like you use a television show analogy, and I use a sports analogy. And Carl's like, "Yeah, great. You guys are really catching on." So
Very
it's
good.
not, though it's quite technical. It's very, we followed along. So I'm looking forward to our listeners getting a chance to kind of learn a lot today as well.
Mhm.
Before we get to Carl, is there anything that you want to highlight?
Just very quickly, I want to alert everyone to our revamped weekly newsletter. So this is the Find Biometrics, formerly Find Biometrics newsletter that has traditionally gone out on Thursdays. Still going out. It's the ID Tech newsletter now. Um, our old format was basically we would highlight usually five major stories from the past week. And the pace of news is so fast now, and we have our daily kind of news roundup digest going out on LinkedIn that a lot of people are discovering. So we just kind of reassessed whether this is the most value we can deliver to people in a weekly newsletter, and we found that a better approach would be to give kind of a high level summary of the big news, all the big news that has happened in the past week and kind of organize it thematically. And I'm really happy with it. I think our team is putting together uh, a really nice, like brief little summary of the big news for anyone who just needs to catch up. So you can go to our site, idtechwire.com, and subscribe to our newsletter there. And if you do, you'll also get our Friday AI update. Usually it goes out on Fridays.
Mhm.
Summary of kind of the big stuff going on in AI, loosely intersecting with identity technology. But for example, our latest one had some news that NVIDIA had developed a new voice manipulation and generation model. So, I mean, you just need to connect the dots for what that means
Mhm.
for deepfakes. So that's the kind of thing we're tracking. But yeah, you'll just get that as kind of a bonus if you sign up. And
It's also a great way to keep track of new episodes of this show.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, we always send out an alert to our subscribers when we have a new episode out. So please do go and subscribe if you're not signed up already.
Yeah, that's a good shout. It should just be at the top of our site. Just click newsletter, and it's very painless and easy.
Indeed.
All right. Thanks for that. Alex, you ready to get to the talk with Carl?
Let's do it. So, Carl, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. And maybe the best place to start, we have a lot that we want to ask you about. But just to start things off, can you tell us a little bit about Lastwall and basically like what you guys do?
Sure. Lastwall is an identity company that focuses on, I would say, critical infrastructure, government, and defense use cases. So when we looked at sort of rewinding the clock a little bit, because we've been around a while, we looked at the state of identity and cybercrime. We said, why do hacks keep happening? And our root cause analysis as good engineers led us to believe that actually most attacks happen because somebody along the way who isn't Alex or Tony manages to use credentials to present themselves as Alex or Tony on a system. So we started asking, how does that happen? Why does it happen? And that was really the origin of Lastwall. We said, okay, well, if we can take a new approach, and this was in the early teens, I guess we call them now.
Mm.
We looked at if we could take a new approach and build a robust IDaaS or identity as a service platform, and really focus less on all use cases and more on the secure use cases. We thought we'd be able to differentiate a bit and build something that was helpful in stopping some of those attacks. So we're a low attack surface, hardened credential identity platform provider. We also have some interesting surrounding tools that help with emerging threats that have come out of our work on identity.
Okay, so you're like focused on the um, highest risk or like most sensitive areas, is it fair to say?
Yeah, the way I think of it is when we started working on the internet, I don't think a lot of people thought about connecting things like critical infrastructure that keeps our society running being connected.
Mhm.
We just sort of kept adding more and more stuff. And, first it was vehicles being connected, then it was power grids being connected. And along the way, we didn't really look at some of the way that the internet works, I think, in a way in which we really designed security to be a fundamental principle. And
Mhm.
so we said, okay, there's some room to try to help with that. So probably a different approach to securing your username for a social platform versus your access credentials for a power plant.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. Yeah, so where did you like where you started? Because you said the initial aim was like we need to have more secure credentials. What was there like an initial approach that you adopted, and is it very different from where you've ended up? Because I know your platform now, I saw when I was looking through the documentation, it was like behavioral biometrics, also something called cognitive biometrics, I think I saw, which I'm not I don't know that I've come across that term yet, but like where did you start and how did you end up at these areas? And what did I miss also?
Yeah, no. So look, I think our approach was informed by what we saw happening on offense, and I guess our founders come from sort of the security curious community and looking at the way that hackers were doing things. And I came from building energy infrastructure and telecommunications infrastructure before that. And when we looked at it, we said, well, how would if we tried to figure out if Alex is actually Alex, how would we do that? And there are the obvious ideas around using biometrics and standard multi-factor authentication. Although, if you rewind the clock a decade, that wasn't as widely deployed. And we sort of said, well, that's great, but relying on a single factor or even two factors isn't as good as relying on lots of data.
Mm.
So where we started and a lot of our early work was doing, I would call it maybe massive multi-factor analysis. So looking at lots of things. And that's where the behavioral biometric pieces and things like keyboard dynamics and mouse movement came in. But also the cognitive biometric side is a term that we use to describe how somebody does things. So, if you look at the way somebody navigates a page or the way they, uh, you know, move a mouse or the way that they engage with a site or a service or a system, there are
Mm.
actually patterns there that are derived in, how you think, and you can use some of those to create some mapping to unique identifiers. Not great for primary authentication or identification, but as an augmenting piece, it worked really well. And so in our early stages, that's a lot of what we did. We looked at, factors from the machine, factors from your network, factors from the way you engaged with the technology and the type of technology that you did. And we still do some of those things in our analysis. But I think really the rise of FIDO2 and the idea of things like passkeys and biometrically bound passkeys that are stored in TPMs, that gives us a new set of tools that sort of become the primary way to do things. And some of these other factors that were maybe more important can fill in the gaps, but aren't necessarily the direct relevant information that you use for primary authentication.
Right. Okay. And before we started recording, you mentioned that you were a subject matter expert at the White House, even though you're at a Canadian company. So was that, you said you were talking about quantum cryptography, I guess, but was there anything else as well? Like what were you doing down there?
Yeah, well, so that's actually much more recent, and that I think to sort of fill in the equation there, through our work in time with the U.S. government and the Department of Defense in the U.S. and Canadian government, we've had the chance to be exposed to some really interesting ideas and thinkers, and I guess that as well through some of my network of people that we get to interface with who are experts in their fields, I've come to know quite a lot. So I was invited through a group. I try to volunteer and help people understand what's going on based on understanding that I've learned. And I was invited to be part of a group of hackers who were invited into the White House to the National Cyber Director's office to talk about the future, and have had the chance to engage through that group and in that context. And part of that was because of some of what we've been working on and researching in quantum cryptographic resilience. So that was the area of subject matter expertise that I was asked to talk about. And I've also done things like gone through a group called Hackers in the Hill to talk with other people about some of these coming problems in Senate and Congress meetings, and have also been to places like NATO headquarters in Europe to talk about, well, why these things are important, how we need to collectively and societally get ahead of some of those challenges.
Yeah. And presumably you've spoken to people in the Canadian government as well, unless don't tell me they don't care at all about about this.
I'm sure there are lots of people who really deeply care in the Canadian government. I have not had the
No.
chance to engage as much and talk to them. We perhaps often look to our friends in the US and in Europe to see what they're doing first. and our experience has just been, I think, through some of our work and through some of the work we've done through time, we've just been a little bit more American centric. But I know Canada has a lot of quantum initiatives, and there's a lot of good work going on here. The Perimeter Institute at Waterloo has a lot of interesting things going on, and there are definitely some ISC elements that are looking through, and I'm sure CSE are also looking into some of this stuff.
Okay, thank you for reassuring me about that. Maybe we should just dig into the quantum stuff a bit, because Tony and I have talked about this before, because it comes up here and there. It's coming up more and more. And I think there's like a growing awareness about the risks, but we were especially interested to talk to you about this because we just haven't had a chance yet to talk to a real like quantum cryptography expert. So maybe to start, like, what is the quantum threat? What does that even mean? How do you explain that to somebody who doesn't understand, who like gets what hacking is, but doesn't really know beyond
You
that?
describing me?
How would you
Just explain it to me.
Okay, well, let me take a stab at this, and pull me up if I get into too much technical depth, because there's a bit of a story here, and that has to do with math and cryptography. And I'll just clarify up front: I am not a cryptographer. I'm really fortunate to work with some people who are very, very technically capable. Uh, I'm on the can communicate about it, but can't necessarily do all the math. So I'll give you maybe a more layman's understanding than some of my
Sounds great.
colleagues might.
Perfect.
So
Yeah.
if we look at how we do cryptography, right, you need a system to take clear text communication, this back and forth between us, apply some rules in some way, and end up with something that is scrambled that somebody who intercepts that can't actually figure out. And there's a couple different types of cryptography. There's symmetric cryptography or symmetric key cryptography, where you have the same key and you distribute that to all parties, and then you use that to encrypt your data, and it's transferred back and forth between parties. More usefully, when it comes to a conversation like this, when we're all remote, is asymmetric cryptography. And that's where you establish your keys, not through a shared key, but through a public key and a private key. And I give you my public key, you encrypt my data, and I'm the one who can decrypt it. And that involves having or any cryptography involves having a really hard trapdoor function, a one-way mathematical function. So it's easy to do one way, but it's really hard to do the other. And if we look at some of the common public key cryptography that we use, it relies on math that takes really large numbers and often really large prime numbers and multiplies them together to get really, really large numbers. And those numbers are like, 600 and some characters long in some cases, and would take a really long time to figure out all of the factors, and therefore which two numbers you combine to make those work. Sort of the, I guess you could say, basic understanding of how something like RSA cryptography works. So you take these two really large prime-derived sort of sets, and you end up with a public key that you can easily give out to everyone, and a private key, which only you have. And that, in theory, works wonderfully. Except in 1994, an American mathematician, Peter Shor, figured out that using the ideas behind quantum computing, you could actually figure out the periodicity of the numbers associated with those large primes and those large prime-derived numbers. And therefore, you could actually very, very quickly, using a quantum computer relatively, you could figure out, if you start with that public key, what a private key is, given that you have a quantum computer that's large enough. And that's a really important point, because that's something a lot of people misunderstand. So, 94, Peter Shor figured this out, published that paper. People are like, wow, that's great, but we don't have quantum computers yet. You fast forward in 2001, there was a team at IBM who then showed, with a nuclear magnetic resonance system, that you could actually run Shor's algorithm. It wasn't just intellectual math, but there was a practical application, and they factored 15. And you think like, oh, wow, okay, factoring 15 isn't that big of a deal. But we went from this could work in theory to we've shown this worked in practice in '01. And that's sort of where I started paying attention. Being a nerdy computer scientist, it was like, oh, wow, that's really neat. And I had a friend who wrote the generalization of, quantum binomial theorem and was into this stuff at Waterloo. And it was, PhD math people. And it was like, wow, that's really interesting. And we sort of said, that's going to be a really big problem someday.
Mhm.
And that was where we left it. But, if you sort of go back 7 or 8 years, NIST started saying, wow, actually, as a standard set, the way we do asymmetric cryptography and even the way we do some of the initialization of that is at risk, because you have something called the discrete log problem, which is also used in some of your key exchange, which also has the same vulnerability to Shor's. And so we came up with, or a bunch of the people at NIST and other governing bodies said, like, at some point we need to move from away from RSA cryptography into something more resilient. And that was the beginning of the search for new, non sort of same approach trapdoor function math, which leads to areas of sort of matrices and really, and interesting other ways of approaching the problem that are mathematically sound, but may be more difficult to implement in real life. And so in 2016, NIST had a competition. There were a bunch of different algorithms that were put together as candidates, and that list has been whittling down because as we move through time, we're actually starting to develop functional quantum computers. And so I think one of the breakthrough pieces that had a lot of people become aware of this was in 2019. I think it was published in 2019 or early 2020. Some researchers at Google and KTH. So at the time, the quantum computers that were available were a couple of qubits. They were very small. Maybe I'm going to guess somewhere around 30 qubits at that time. By the way, we're up to maybe 1,000 qubit systems now. And the Google and KTH researchers said, okay, well, how big of a quantum computer do we need to actually break current cryptography? And so they got together and they worked through this and they said, actually, if you get to a 20 million qubit quantum computer in about 8 hours, it will be able to break RSA. And that was based on a series of assumptions that were valid at that time. And that comes where, what happened from that is a lot of people looked at this and said, okay, well, we've got, 10 or 20 years to solve this problem, maybe longer, maybe never, because that's, 20 million qubits and we're, at, sub 100 in the vast majority of systems that didn't even really work very well. That is a problem for later.
It's a lot of qubits.
Yeah. And so along the way, people sort of said, hey, this is a big problem for the future. But we definitely, something similar happened in computing with CPU architectural design, where in the 90s, people decided, in an attempt to make computers work better, CPU architecture started doing speculative processing. So, your processor starts running down branches that are possible in your compute. And people at the time said, hey, that information bleed might actually become problematic later. And everyone then kind of forgot about it. And then in, I think it was 2015, 2016 timeframe, all of a sudden we had the Spectre and Meltdown attacks. I don't know if you guys remember those. Where it's like, oh my goodness.
You're losing me here.
Okay, so there are these big attacks where basically what happened was people realized that the processors inside our computers had problems. And it caused, a bunch of the IT world to have to apply patches at an Intel processor level to stop this extra capability that also provided a vulnerability. So it was an example of we realized it was going to be a problem and then it became a problem. In the same way, we've gone from realizing that this threat to our current asymmetric cryptography will be a problem to we're approaching the threshold of it is going to be a problem and it may be a problem soon. And, because what's happening now is in anticipation of having that ability to break our cryptography, our asymmetric cryptography. And for example, all the information that would go across a session like this over the internet Uh, there are groups, if you think large nation state groups, well resourced, who are capturing the current data that's encrypted, and they're storing that for later on to be able to
Right.
decrypt it. So these are called
Right.
harvest now, decrypt later, or store now, decrypt later attacks. So while we don't have a quantum computer now that can actually break the cryptography, we're starting to capture data now with the understanding that at some point in the future, that cryptography can be broken.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So if you had, for example, research that was really, really valuable, that's still going to be valuable in 5 or 10 years, or if you have, let's take an example, really important symmetric key cryptography keys that you need to share with somebody over the internet that are going into a system that's going to be active for 10 or 15 years, or if you've got like important secrets of any kind that need to remain secret, which in some places, in some companies, they have, um, and in some organizations, government organizations, and all kinds of different organizations, you have secrets that you really want to remain secret for a long time. That's some of the risk that we're facing now.
Right.
Yeah. I keep thinking of this interview that I saw recently with Brian Cox, this physicist. Have you heard of him?
I have.
Um, yeah, he said something that I that I keep repeating to my girlfriend. He said, "We are going to tomorrow." You can't say,
Sounds
"Let's
like
not go to tomorrow." Like tomorrow is coming, and it really stuck in my head. And
sounds like
made me think of that with this quantum problem, which is like we know this is going to be an issue.
hmm
Like for sure it's going to be. So it's just a matter of time. Another reason that I thought of it while we were talking is that he said information can't be destroyed. It can only really be transformed. He's talking about physics, but I can't help but think of it when we think about like turning all of this valuable data into an encrypted format. It's just another version of the same information. And sooner or later, somebody might be able to figure it out.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think one of the things that we can look at in the last 10 years is more and more information is being created and more of that information is being stored. And
Mm,
particularly now with AI systems or machine learning systems that require vast amounts of data, data centers are popping up all over the place and we're storing more and more and more data. So the percentage, I would be interested if somebody out there has the actual data, and maybe some of your listeners have that, but the amount of information that's being stored versus the amount of information that's being created. I suspect that we're storing orders of magnitude more information than we were even a few years ago.
mm,
So when you start thinking of that information then being captured somewhere with the assumption that, wow, all of this is safe and secure. Um, there, if you think fast forward a few years and it may not be safe and secure, there may be things that you might not want to put on the internet, or you might want to make sure you have better cryptography to make sure it stays secure.
yeah.
Um,
I want to understand that these different approaches to cryptography, but first I want to drag us into a physics cul-de-sac, possibly. Just because I want to know if if I've got this right, because when Tony and I have talked about the quantum issue in the past, my understanding is that quantum mechanics allows for a particle to be in two places at the same time, which doesn't seem like it should be physically possible to us in the Newtonian world, but that is what happens. And am I correct that a quantum computer essentially is doing a version of that where it doesn't have to choose between a one or a zero, and it can literally both be one and zero at the same time, and somehow that makes its computing like exponentially faster? Have I got that basically right?
um, yes and no. I mean, you've got the concept solidly down. I think what it produces instead of a binary operator, one or zero. It has to be one of those things. You have I believe they're called unary operators, where you have that ability to be one or zero or both. And so what it means is that you can apply different formulas and different mathematical approaches to how you flow information through a system. And it allows you to design systems differently that can exploit those properties.
Okay.
So what that results in is it lets you access a very different mathematical approach to problem solving, which in some cases can produce solutions like the implementation of Shor's algorithm. It can produce solutions that are um, much different and much faster at solving certain types of problems. And that being qualified, you have to have the right sort of operating environments to be able to observe those quantum effects in a quantum processor.
Mm-hmm.
So, an interesting fact that some of the folks were talking about at Quantum World Congress this year is, they said, hey, the coldest place in the universe is actually some place in upstate New York where one of these processors is running. Because what happens is when you're trying to observe entanglement and this sort of effect of like, hey, is that a one or a zero? Is that thing in that place or this place or both places, and how that effect manifests? Anytime you introduce noise to that system, your qubits, which are the quantum bits, can stop working properly. There's this idea called decoherence, and where basically that's like they stop making sense and they produce output that isn't ideal. So you have to try to control the environmental factors to reduce the noise in a system, to reduce the energy in a system. And it turns out, yeah, if you cool something down to almost absolute zero, colder than space, there's very little energy that gets into that system. And that's where you can start having these quantum effects reliably observed, and where your qubits can actually remain stable for longer and can produce outputs that are replicatable and therefore useful. And then from there, you can start building systems around quantum gates and properties that allow you to apply these different algorithms.
Right.
Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah. I thought the coldest place in the universe was Tony's heart when his favorite soccer team is losing, but I say corrected.
You don't even
Uh,
know, man. You don't even know.
Hey, I'm in science we trust. Let's measure. Yeah, I think, Alex, there's this understanding that people have, or maybe misunderstanding, that quantum computers will just be able to do everything way better and way faster. And
Mhm.
like, we are a long ways from having a quantum computer that you can sit on your desktop and can run things with. That is a long, long ways in the future. The era of quantum computing that we're at, to sort of compare it to the classical computers we're used to, is probably closer to the computer takes up the whole floor of a building or the whole building and requires punch cards to
Mhm.
use and only does one thing,
Mhm.
and takes maybe a long time to do that one thing. But sometimes that one thing it can do in a way that is way faster or not possible for current classical systems to do. So
Right.
if we backtrack to sort of where we began this, if you think of this idea of Shor's algorithm, um, being able to rapidly factor things or break the discrete log problem, you're going from, in a classical approach, somewhere in the range of 2 to the power of 112 operations with a classical system. So in terms of timescale, think like heat death of the universe. You're moving from that to 2 to the power of 35 operations. So like long weekend project for your quantum computer,
Mhm.
in terms of breaking that math. So that's going effectively from a capability of, not currently possible because our sun will run out of power before you fix it with a classical computer to 8 hours with 20 million qubits. And even that is up for debate whether it's going to take that long. But
Mhm.
that doesn't mean that it's going to make Minecraft run an order of magnitude faster or your Excel sheets work really great, because it's a fundamentally different approach to systems and architecture, and all the logical ideas, or the vast majority of them, that we've built for binary computers that have ones and zeros have to be rebuilt from the ground up for quantum based systems. And that's
Wasn't
happening as we talk, which is amazing.
wasn't there a story about a month, less than a month ago, a few weeks ago, about researchers in Shanghai who used quantum computer to crack RSA, and it was like 50 bits, which is very small compared to what is it like? I'm looking at it now,
Yeah, they
2048.
yeah. Yeah, I remember what you're talking about, Tony.
Yeah, and so we briefly talked about it. I think you and I, Alex, talked about it on the show in like a weekly rundown thing. And I don't understand it, but I do understand that it's what you're kind of alluding to, Carl, where you say that, you know, we're we're not there yet or anywhere near there, and the capability of these quantum computers is nothing compared to what the threat would be, but the first steps are being taken and things are being done that weren't necessarily thought to be possible, and you have to prepare for those things, right? So I just wanted to ask you, like, what do you do with Lastwell to kind of prepare for quantum, I don't know, problems, for lack of a better term, like quantum readiness, essentially? What do you guys do on that front?
Yeah, and this is a really good question, because it begs, there are a couple parts to this, and one is, if I address that first um, posting that came out a couple of weeks ago or a month ago, saying like, oh, every now and again you have these sensational claims of, like, happened a few years ago as well. Oh, we've broken RSA cryptography, or these sensational hyped up claims don't actually do what really is going on here a lot of good,
Mm-hmm.
because there is a very real threat. I mean, let me put it this way to you. Um, the assumptions that were built around that 20 million qubit requirement to be able to break current cryptography, that was built before we really had a lot of the interesting machine learning that we've seen in the last few years helping research speed up. That was built before we had some fundamental breakthroughs in quantum computing that reduced the threshold, or the number of errors that these systems have. So, the assumptions at the time that they said we need 20 million qubits were based on needing a really, really large number of qubits that are unstable to produce one logical qubit. So you take a lot of different systems that have errors, and you put, say, 500 of these things together, and you look at the aggregate output, and you look at what is probabilistic between all of these, and you can get a good answer. So those, let's say that those 500 qubits equals 1 qubit of output, and that was why you
Mm-hmm.
needed 20 million of these things. If you look at Shor's paper, from my understanding of it, you need 2n plus 2 qubits, which for 2048-bit RSA is 4,100 qubits. Now, if you look at what we have now, you have people like IBM with System 2 who are approaching 1,000 qubits. And so the threshold to 4,100 fault tolerant qubits, we're moving closer and closer towards reality. So this is more of a threat. But then on the back end of this, or on the other side, there is this monumental task to change the current cryptography that we use to new quantum resilient cryptography. So imagine if I came to you and I said, hey, Tony, we need to change um, all of the systems in the United States from imperial to metric. Well, we might sort of chuckle at that as Canadians and say, haha, we're ahead of this. But, if you stop and you look at that idea and you said, we're going to have to change huge numbers of things from one system to another system, That means all the tools that you use to measure things with. That means all the reference documents you have about how large standard size things are. Everything needs to change. And then if you said, hey, we know that if we don't change over from imperial to metric in the United States or in North America writ large or the world, if we don't do that before a critical date, our economy is going to break.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that we use the internet is going to stop functioning. Well, people would be like, oh, okay, that's a problem. That's the next logical question is, when's that going to happen? And the answer is, well, we don't know, but we've got to do it before
Yeah.
this date. That's sort of the problem we have with shifting to quantum resilient cryptography.
Right.
So, at Lastwall, we've looked at all the cryptography that's used inside an identity system, everything from, the way that you store internal data, the way that you encrypt data, the way that you transmit that encrypted data from you to a third party. And we've used quantum resilient algorithms to create a resilient to asymmetric cryptography breaking system, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, one of the most obvious ones would be like if you look at an internet session going back and forth between us, we're using RSA cryptography, probably X, 25509 to encrypt the initial stage of the connection. Switching from that to using best-in-class current cryptography and a quantum resilient algorithm, in this case, something called ML-Chem, or what's now FIPS, the Federal Information Processing Standard 203. You take the best current cryptography that we have asymmetrically, and you take one of the new accepted, robustly tested over the last 8 years algorithms, and you combine them together to encapsulate your keys so that you've got quantum resilience. But if it turns out we find out later on there's a problem with that algorithm, you still have our best current in class system. And you say, okay, well, we're going to apply that to every TLS session, every internet connection that goes back and forth. Fantastic way to start protecting systems against somebody just grabbing that from the internet in its encrypted state and being able to decrypt it later. But then you might start looking at things like, wow, okay, where in your other systems, if you look at your hardware systems, where do we have key slots for 2048-bit RSA? And in some cases, because that's a thing, when you start using new cryptography, your key sizes change. So, you're going from 2048 bits. Well, depending on which implementations you use, you might end up with many, many more bits, potentially a million bits. So if you have a piece of hardware that has a 2048-bit key slot, you need to fit a new, much larger key in because you're doing this key encapsulation. That's easy to do if you've done it in software, but if you need to do that in hardware, it becomes problematic. So one of the first challenges that we're coming up against now is even having people audit their systems and find out all the places that they've used which cryptography. So, people are doing cryptographic bills of material, and there's interesting work going on there. So you can come up with a list of all the places you need to replace this stuff. That's why we need to start now, and we need organizations to start looking at this now, because when you start looking at all the places cryptography is used, holy wow, in modern systems, there's an incredibly large amount of cryptography used just about everywhere. And for every internet-based system, there are lots of subsystems that we rely on. And all of these need to go from, classical asymmetric to quantum resilient systems. So, a lot, it's going to take us many years to migrate from RSA as a standard, or ECC, to something that's quantum resilient. And there's an intermediary phase where we're saying, hey, keep using best in class, just wrap it inside this new quantum resilient technology or cryptography and start moving over to that. So the really great thing is Google, we've been working with them for a while on this. Google has started doing things like they're making quantum resilient cryptography available in the browser. So it's really neat. If you took one of our systems and you go to log into Lastwall and then you log into a third-party cloud service, that whole session can be end-to-end quantum resilient now without your users even noticing.
Yeah.
But you have to have things like load balancers that work for that. And you have to have systems inside your systems that do that. And in the case of identity, we're working on things like, hey, how would you have a device-bound passkey that's quantum resilient? Then how would you put that into a hardware token? How do you store
Mhm.
that safely and effectively on a drive in a secure way? So there are things like that that are going on at the leading edge, and all of that has to go from, hey, we're doing this in practice, to, well, yes, we've completed that transition to make sure we're secure from store now, decrypt later. And hopefully that all happens before we have some more fundamental breakthroughs. And we've been having a number of those that have been
Mhm.
compressing the timeline between now and what we call Q Day, which is when we have that cryptographically relevant quantum computer that can actually break our cryptography. But
Mm.
again, that's the problem. It's kind of like
Yeah.
Y2K,
Yeah.
except we
Yeah.
can't tell you what date.
That's that's what I was running through in my head with the at the beginning of your analogy. I was like, oh, it's like Y2K, except it's real.
Yeah. I
Right. And
also,
and we can't tell you when. And there's a lot
Yeah.
of debate about whether that's soon or a long time away.
Yeah.
and I think to bolster your case, I believe like there's a common misconception with Y2K where people are like, it got so hyped up and nothing happened. But the reason nothing happened is that so many people were working hard to make sure nothing would happen. And it sounds like that's analogous, at least. But like you say, like everyone knew when the deadline was with Y2K.
Mhm.
Um, but I was wondering if I have kind of, I'm having a hard time conceptualizing what it means for something to be like quantum resilient. Like normal cryptography, this is going to be a huge oversimplification, and I'm sorry for sounding stupid, but um, like standard cryptography is basically making like a really long code, right? Stand in place for some other piece of information. It sounds like quantum cryptography is not simply making the code longer, right? It's you can you elaborate on how it's different? What is quantum cryptography, and do your best in like layman's terms. Bear with me.
No problem. Okay, so it's not that the code necessarily needs to be longer in your example. It's that the rules that you used or the algorithm that you used to generate that is different and can't be broken. Quantum resilient cryptography, we've got this known way to take currently encrypted data and at some point in the future start with that public key and decrypt that information. We know that. So what quantum resilient cryptography does is it takes a different approach to creating that scrambled encrypted string of data, that ciphertext. So you start with so you think, let's start with plain text. And I have the word, Alex, and in plain text, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to apply uh, a level of encryption to that. So I change everything forward in the alphabet by one. So, A becomes B, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you've got that method to go from your normal plain text to your encrypted text. In that case, extremely simple. We know that that algorithm that we're currently using, a quantum computer will be able to figure out sometime in the future. So what we're doing is we're saying, let's switch from just moving forward one step in the alphabet in our really simple example to let's switch to a system that goes backwards in the alphabet, or maybe goes backwards in the alphabet for the first character and forwards in the alphabet for a second. It takes a systems approach that is different. In this case, going from, hey, we're going to take two really large numbers and multiply them together to make a massive number. So it's easy to do that mathematically. We're going from that sort of large factorization problem, and we're using a different type of math, which is based in lattice-based math. So it's just the application of a different problem to create the encrypted text. Does that help? Or is that more confusing?
I don't know what lattice-based math is, but I think I get the gist of what you're saying.
Uh, I would love to go into n-dimensional vector, into vector space and like matrix math or large matrices. I'm not very good at them, but suffice it to say that if you looked, there are many problems in math that are that what they call those one-way functions, where just like taking two numbers and multiplying them together, that's relatively easy. But if you start with the end result and it's a really big number and you go backwards to the beginning, there's many possible permutations, and it takes a lot of computing power to go backwards. So one way is easy, the other way is hard. And we're just taking the idea of factorization or the discrete log problem for finite fields in the case of handshakes. We're saying this class of problem will be broken. So we're going to move to a different set of problems where you start looking at, without getting very mathy about it, I'm not sure how to explain that, but where you're taking just a different approach to creating the encrypted text that doesn't have a known way for a functional quantum computer to break right away.
Right.
Um,
I think we could keep this going, and then eventually you would have hand puppets, and it'd be like a horse and like a spoon, and Alex and I would just be like, oh. But
Yeah.
that, I mean, that I feel like I'm further along than I was a few minutes ago.
No, I think
yeah.
I have a weird analogy that I think might help. You tell me if this is stupid, but you kind of made me think of like watching a TV series, and like eventually you get to the point where you're like, I know what's going to happen, and you can predict every plot point because you're like, I know this show. And you're saying we don't need to just have like a longer series where more things happen. We're going to change the genre. So like the spy show is going to become a romance, and like no one will know, like no one will be able to guess what the next plot point is. Is that kind of a useful analogy?
Yeah, that actually is quite a useful analogy. Except you have
You
to
can
think
use
right
that.
now, for the last 20 years, we've all been watching the same spy show,
Right.
and it always ends in the same way because maybe the writers are lazy and they applied a formula to like the good guy always has to win at the end.
Right.
And then we're going, yeah. Then all of a sudden you start watching a romantic comedy and you're totally confused because it doesn't make sense along the same lines. So
Yeah.
yeah, that actually is that's a neat way of thinking about it. And I would say that's in terms of the implications of this, I think that's where we can vector in on and we can say, wow, the moral of the story is, yeah, you need to start changing from all of your spy series TV shows that have predictable plots to different types of TV programs. And fantastically, NIST have gone through and have watched all of the other possible genres and have said reality TV and Survivor is so different from your spy shows that switch to that and you'll be safe.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
My sports brain was trying to go to like if and really in any sport, even individual sports, when you're going to be facing a specific type of opponent in the future, you have to be prepared to change your strategy, whether it's in tennis or a team sport. You're like, oh, we're going up against these guys in a couple of games, and they're going to be really good at their offense is incredible. So we need to be able to change the way we play defense to stifle them and surprise them, and so that they can't break us down the way that they excel at.
Yeah.
Right. Or maybe, if you looked at this and you said, wow, there's a systematic problem associated with that style of offense for a team.
Mm-hmm.
And they do that every time without fail. They do that exact play. And there's a way,
Mm-hmm.
wow, if you can do this, you're going to get through.
Yeah.
Yep. Switch it up. And that's the practical recommendation that I'd have for people listening is you have to start deploying some kind of quantum resilient systems. And these are open, open source algorithms or freely available algorithms. And you can start using those in places, but we all need to intentionally think about our software design and our system design and start incorporating that. It's like,
Yeah.
that's where we come back to that analogy of switching from imperial to metric.
Right.
It's not like that we need to switch to some new, no one knows it math. We need to switch from one way of doing things that's known to a different way of doing things, and that's a huge shift.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not necessarily a difficult shift. So we've got, along the way when we were building our quantum resilient identity project for one of our clients, that was one of the first sort of cloud-based systems that they were using, they said, hey, we want to protect against this threat. Well, one of the things that we needed to build was, we said, wow, to establish a session between the browser that's going to use this and our backend systems, you need to have a load balancer that can handle those algorithms. So we built a load balancer that could easily do, not only normal cryptography, but quantum resilient cryptography. And it turns out that Google had been building that into the browser. So, we've got this, Quantum Shield product, which is a resilient load balancer that can just be deployed. And in the same way, people can build products of their own. They could use something like that. They could look at their own systems and builds and say, hey, if we know this cryptography that we're currently using has a shelf life, we don't know exactly when that's going to end, but we know that if we don't switch over before that, it's going to cause some problems. They can start switching over now. And that was so this August, the US government and NIST sort of came up with the sort of certification of NIST, or FIPS, pardon me, the Federal Information Processing Standard, with a new standard, which is FIPS 203, which is taking best-in-class current cryptography and ML Chem, or Kyber, which was the original name for that particular type of alternative solution. And they put those together and they've said, this is acceptable for use, and we've tested it robustly, and this is now approved for use. So in regulated industries, people can start deploying that. And we're starting to see things like banks are starting to experiment and deploy these things. And our browsers are starting to experiment, deploy these things. We need to think of, like, all the other places where we use asymmetric cryptography. We need to have people start thinking about how we can shift over now. And, sometimes because of things like key length, or in the case of some of the hashing algorithms, or signing keys, it changes some of the properties in the operating parameters. So you want to start trying these things out now, so that when you come to that next hardware refresh cycle, for example, you automatically just build those upgrades in, as opposed to, and this is the thing. I talk to people and I say, hey, start building a plan for how you're going to transition to quantum resilience. What does that mean? It means categorizing what cryptography you currently use, and then having a plan, usually prioritized by what's most important, to shift over to quantum resilient algorithms, and start thinking about, like, places where, like with load balancers, where you can get broad coverage across a lot of different things to protect against a particular threat. In that case, that would be somebody pulling encrypted data from the internet and storing it for later. So you can start applying those things and seeing how well they work in your environments. And then you can build that into a long-term plan to migrate all of your things over to quantum resilient cryptography. And the objective is to societally get as quickly as we can from use of this current cryptography to this future quantum resilient cryptography, which, again, if everyone could make a move and decide, that'd be great. But it takes time to change systems, and I'm sure you guys have seen before. They're complicated environments where you can't just necessarily click your fingers and know everything you have to do to even patch systems, let alone fix all of them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about intention and planning, and building a process to walk forward into that. So hopefully in a few years, without really a lot of end users noticing, we'll all just be using quantum resilient cryptography.
That
That
yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it happens to be a really good note to end on, even though we have more questions.
if you do have this sort of set of choices, we only know one thing. We're either going to deploy quantum resilient cryptography too early or too late.
Yeah.
And deploying it too early will actually probably lead to more planning, organization, and less overall cost. But it requires us doing something now that doesn't necessarily feel like we need to. If we do it too late, well, there could be other ramifications that aren't so nice. So maybe that's a point to leave it on and say thank you for having me on your show today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, this was really illuminating. And as you can tell, it's a subject we're just starting to wrap our heads around. So this was a great first step for us.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Karl.